if you would have a magic wand, what would be a solution for those problems?
So a lot of the conversation around adaptation progress comes down to, first planning. Like we obviously need the plans to understand what we're supposed to be doing, but then also investment. So how do we then start actually implementing the plans? And I think that is the weak point. But I think if we can shift the conversation around, because everything they say, oh, but it's going to cost this much, it's going to cost this much. When we look at some of the scenarios, like if you have no adaptation, like
it's going to cost a lot more.
It's going to cost a lot more. And we know that already. And so I think the good example is like Copenhagen. So they had this massive rain event and so much flooding, and they were looking at the damages, but they were also looking at future scenarios, and they're like, okay, actually, if we invest now in a proper, like we make the drainage in the city bigger and we rethink how we manage the water, like we're going to save in the future. We're going to save so much money, but we need to do the investment, and they did that. Often the conversation is very like, because some of the benefits of adaptation will not come in the next 4 years. They will maybe, come in the next 10 years. And it is, so the timescale aspect of adaptation is often quite difficult to explain. It's like, why do we need this investment now? It's like, because, if you look at increasing, rainfall in the area, or increasing drought in your area, and if you have nothing in place, like you cannot keep the people and ecosystem safe, or you have to come up with very, very expensive ways then, in the future. But there is this kind of time lag as well. And so when we talk about adaptation benefits, they don't happen, necessarily for this generation. And they might happen, in 20 years from now. And so who's around to say, yes, I was the mayor, I made the investment, and now 30 years later, look at my legacy. But I think we do need to start thinking about, what are the legacies that adaptation can leave for the communities and for the ecosystems.
Tom, I like your how you asked what your local climate strategy was. I wish I could do that in Texas, but nobody here actually believes in climate change. So I doubt we have anything like that. Something that stood out to me was the idea that, this takes sometimes the effects won't be seen till, multiple generations later, or at least, 20, 30 years, in the future. It's sort of joked about in the filmmaking world that if you're a really good audio tech on set, or you're a really good lighting person, and you really know how to light a scene, if you do your job right, the audience won't notice it. Yeah, exactly. If there's a really beautiful shot in a movie, people are just going to go, wow, that's a really beautiful shot. They're not really going to know why. They just know it's going to be beautiful. Whereas if you mess up the lighting, or you mess up the audio, or you mess up the camera settings, then it's really obvious something went wrong. One of the things with climate adaptation is that if you do it right, nobody will really know, because they're still living in that area and everything's fine. Whereas if you don't do it right, it's a desert, or it's underwater, and it's really obvious that something got screwed up along the way. I think about that a lot whenever it comes down to, putting up from a city's perspective, or a state's perspective, or something like that, where it's, we're going to put $1 billion forwards to do all of these adaptation things that we might not even know if it works, quote unquote, know if it works, because if it does work, then life will just sort of continue as normal. So I feel like quantifying that's an interesting challenge.
No, absolutely. And I love that analogy, because it's very true. And it's the same for disaster risk reduction. So often we say, well, why do we have to do these investments now? We could spend the money on something else. And I think local level governments in particular, they're like a microcosmos of the society. It's like there's so many different priorities and values. And when you start talking about, and city that works, people don't notice the way, the mechanisms and processes that actually make it work. When it doesn't, everyone, kind of stops and goes, hang on, what's happening? So I think you're right. And in the public conversation, for instance, in Australia, I'm always very I take a lot of media just to explain adaptation, because I think we do need to also recognize its role, but also start changing the conversation. Very difficult challenge for a politician, to put in all this investment and then not being able to show that I improved this road in this place. It's not, sometimes adaptation is not about just hard infrastructure. It's about, there's so many things that you do, for instance, with ecosystems that people don't really notice necessarily. So there's lots of images from all around the world where they have measured, for instance, a city where they only had roads and they have, car parks, and then they measured the temperature of the similar road somewhere where there is trees and lots of nature. And you can see the temperature differences, for instance. I think that's often quite a stark reminder for people how we build these environments that are not fit for humans or for ecosystems. And then you kind of get that. I think that always, it's a lot easier to explain what adaptation is when you have that stark contrast, and you can kind of show something rather than say, well, in 20 years time you'll be much safer.
Yeah, because it's like how does what does that mean? I think people, especially if they don't think about that, if they're not like me or you or Tom, and we're walking around every day thinking about that, people are going about their lives, and if you try and explain that to someone, it's like, oh no, but you're gonna it's gonna be so much better of an environment, trust me. They're gonna go it's fine how it is now, I don't know, or maybe there's some small complaints they have, but yeah, I think using examples like that where it's isn't this part of town so much nicer where there's more parks or trees, or I think that's a good way to sort of get people thinking, at least on a small scale. Is there anything that you've seen in particular that's worked for you whenever you're trying to explain something? Maybe that could be to a policymaker, maybe that could be to just somebody who is in a position of power, that maybe they're like a business owner or they have influence. Is there any talking points or something like what you just mentioned that kind of works for you?
I think a lot of people are interested in the numbers. So when, for instance, I was on a call on private sector adaptation, and a lot of the times, because it's a climate-related financial disclosure, there is a kind of more common language around that. Well, what does that look like to your bottom line? What does that look like for your operations or your supply chain? Where are the climate risks, and what can you actually do? So I think a lot of the times having conversations around adaptation that are quite practical and going, you have all these risks that are, going to impact your company or your operations. How's your staff going to come to work if there's, massive flooding all around the factory, or there's massive heat waves and they can't actually work in the factory or get to work anymore? So I think there's a lot of conversations around energy security. How do you make sure that, and that's kind of adaptation mitigation. So how do you make sure that you have a stable electricity system, for instance, in a factory, that can keep going even during heat waves and all that impact and pressure that it puts on the actual infrastructure. But it's also around the saving, I think. So well-being, but also conversations around that if you don't do the investments now, it's going to cost you a lot more. And I know that's market speak, but for a lot of those people, that's what they have to respond to. They have to go to their boards and their shareholders and say, there is an economic rationale to do adaptation. And I think the more we can target different types of messages in different decision contexts, I think that's when we kind of start seeing maybe more acceptance, more understanding around, well, what does adaptation actually mean to me? Or what does it mean for my company? Or what does it mean for my community? So I think the role of science communication in particular, and communication overall, I think it has such a massive role in how we can change the way that people think.
I like that.